Imagine standing at the edge of the greatest military gamble in modern history, where one wrong decision could collapse the entire Allied effort in Western Europe and hand Adolf Hitler the breathing room he desperately needed to regroup and unleash fresh devastation upon the continent. In the summer of 1944, after the blood-soaked miracle of the Normandy landings on June 6th, the Allied armies were pushing through the Bocage country of France, fighting hedge by hedge, field by field, in brutal conditions that chewed through men and machines at an alarming rate. The liberation of Europe was not the clean, sweeping advance that maps and history books suggest. It was grinding, agonizing, and deeply uncertain. And right at the heart of that uncertainty, two of America's most formidable commanders were locked in a confrontation that would define the entire course of the Western campaign. General Omar Bradley, cautious, methodical, and burdened by the weight of strategic reality, stood face to face with the explosive ambition of General George S. Patton, a man who believed that speed, audacity, and the psychological shock of rapid advance could win the war before winter arrived. What happened between them in those critical weeks of August 1944 is one of the most consequential and least understood command decisions of the entire Second World War. And the story, when told in full, reveals not just military strategy, but the raw human tension between vision and prudence, between glory and survival. The outcome would shape the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives and determine whether the Allies would reach Berlin before the Soviet forces from the East. If this kind of deep, unfiltered military history is what you hunger for, then right now is the moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Because what most people were never taught is far more dramatic than any Hollywood film. Drop a comment below and tell us what you already knew and what genuinely surprised you. Because this community thrives on real historical dialogue, and your perspective matters more than you might think. The seeds of this clash were planted long before the beaches of Normandy were stained red. George S. Patton had been one of the most aggressive and visionary armor commanders in the American military, a student of Rommel's tactics, an admirer of speed and shock, and a man whose ego burned as brightly as his tactical genius. But after the notorious slapping incidents in Sicily in August 1943, where Patton struck two hospitalized soldiers whom he accused of cowardice, his career had nearly ended entirely. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was forced to publicly reprimand Patton and sideline him, using him instead as a decoy, the commander of the fictional 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, designed to convince German intelligence that the main Allied invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. This deception, known as Operation Fortitude, worked spectacularly, tying down significant German armored reserves well after D-Day. But for Patton, the role of Phantom Commander was an unbearable humiliation for a man who lived to fight. When he was finally given command of the real Third Army on August 1, 1944, just as Operation Cobra had shattered the German lines near Saint-Lô, he erupted into the French countryside with a ferocity that stunned even his own superiors. Within days, his columns were racing through Avranches, pouring out of the Normandy bottleneck, and threatening to envelop an enormous portion of the German army, Group B, in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. The speed of Patton's advance in early August 1944 was nothing short of extraordinary, and it created both an unprecedented opportunity and a dangerous temptation. His Third Army was moving so fast that supply lines were being stretched to their absolute limits, and the logistical system that Eisenhower and his planners had constructed was beginning to buckle under the strain. Fuel, ammunition, and food were being consumed at rates that pre-invasion planners had never anticipated for this phase of operations. And it was precisely in this context that Patton, whose mind never stopped generating bold operational concepts, began pushing for something that would either win the war outright or risk catastrophic defeat. He wanted to split his forces, sending powerful armored columns in two divergent directions simultaneously. One thrust racing northeast toward Paris and the Seine River, and another driving hard to the east toward the German border itself, aiming eventually at the Rhine. The concept was intoxicating in its ambition. If successful, it would cut off German retreat routes, liberate Paris, and potentially end organized German resistance in France within weeks. But it assumed a level of logistical capacity and flank security that Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, believed simply did not exist on the ground. The gap between Patton's vision and the physical reality of fuel trucks, road conditions, and exposed flanks was not a matter of timidity. It was a matter of arithmetic. Omar Nelson Bradley was, in many ways, everything Patton was not. Where Patton was theatrical, flamboyant, and instinctive, Bradley was quiet, measured, and deeply analytical. Known as the GI's general for his genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary soldiers, Bradley had earned his place at the top of American military command not through spectacle, but through meticulous competence. He had commanded 2 corps in Tunisia and Sicily, performing solidly, if not brilliantly, and Eisenhower had chosen him to command the American ground forces for the Normandy invasion precisely because he trusted Bradley's judgment under pressure. By August 1944, Bradley was overseeing not just Patton's Third Army, but also General Courtney Hodges' First Army, and he had to manage both as components of a coherent whole while coordinating with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to the north. The picture Bradley saw every morning in his command post was not the exhilarating panorama of open exploitation that fired Patton's imagination. It was a complex web of competing demands, insufficient supplies, vulnerable flanks, and the constant threat of German counterattack. When Hitler ordered Operation Luttich on August 7, 1944, sending German armor westward toward Mortain in a desperate attempt to cut off the Allied breakout at Avranches, Bradley's worst fears about exposed flanks were suddenly and violently confirmed. The German attack failed, but it demonstrated exactly how dangerous overextension could be, and it hardened Bradley's resolve against any plan that dispersed American strength before the Falaise trap could be properly closed. The Falaise pocket itself became the central obsession of Allied command in the second week of August 1944, and it was here that the tension between Bradley and Patton reached its most operationally significant point. Canadian forces pushing south from the Caen area and American forces sweeping north were converging on the town of Falaise, threatening to encircle nearly 20 German divisions, roughly 100,000 men from the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Patton could see the opportunity with crystalline clarity. His 15 Corps, under General Wade Hayslip, had raced to Argentan by August 13th, and Patton was ready to push north of the Army Group boundary to link up with the Canadians and slam the trap shut. He famously telephoned Bradley and declared that he could drive to Falaise and beyond, closing the pocket entirely. But Bradley refused to authorize the advance beyond Argentan, instructing Patton to halt and hold. The decision has been debated by historians ever since. Bradley's reasoning was threefold. He feared a collision between American and Canadian forces in the chaos of battle. He believed the Canadians were close enough to close the gap themselves, and he was deeply concerned about the ability of Hayslip's corps to hold against the desperate German forces trying to break out eastward. Critics, including Patton himself, argued bitterly that the halt allowed tens of thousands of German soldiers to escape through the Falaise Gap before it was finally closed on August 21st. Soldiers who would fight again in the Siegfried Line and in the Ardennes. The escape of German forces through the Falaise Gap, estimated at between 20,000 and 40,000 men who slipped out before the pocket closed, cast a long shadow over the Allied triumph in Normandy. The battlefield itself, when Allied forces moved through it in the final days of August 1944, presented scenes of almost unimaginable destruction. Thousands of German vehicles, horses, artillery pieces, and the bodies of men and animals lay strewn across the narrow lanes between Falaise and Trun in what Allied commanders described as a killing ground of historic proportions. General Eisenhower, walking the field on August 20th, reportedly said it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards stepping only on dead bodies. The German army in the West had been shattered, but not destroyed. And those who escaped carried with them the institutional knowledge, the experienced officers and NCOs, and the hardened combat instinct that would make the battles of autumn and winter 1944 far more costly than Allied planners had hoped. For Bradley, the partial escape of German forces was a painful outcome, But he never wavered in his conviction that splitting Patton's forces in the way Patton had proposed would have created vulnerabilities that an enemy still capable of offensive action, as Mortain had proven, could have exploited with potentially disastrous results. The argument was not about courage or vision. It was about the cold mathematics of war. This is the exact midpoint of a story that most history classes never had the courage to tell fully. And if you're still here, it means you understand that real history is not simple, not clean, and not kind to heroes or villains alike. Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already. Give this video a like so that more people can find it. And share it with someone in your life who loves military history or who believes that great decisions are made by great men without doubt or conflict, because this story proves otherwise. And leave a comment telling us, do you think Bradley made the right call at Argenton, or did Patton's instinct deserve to be trusted? Your answer says more about military strategy than you might expect. With the Falaise battle behind them and German forces in full retreat across the Seine River, the fundamental strategic question that Patton had been raising since August now demanded a direct answer from Eisenhower himself. The debate was no longer just between Bradley and Patton. It had escalated into a full confrontation between the two primary strategic visions for finishing the war in Europe. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group and still nominally the overall ground forces commander until September 1st, was advocating for a single powerful thrust in the north, through Belgium and across the Rhine into the Ruhr industrial heartland of Germany. A narrow, concentrated blow that he argued could end the war by Christmas 1944, if given absolute logistical priority. Patton, characteristically, was advocating the opposite. Give him the fuel and the freedom to drive his Third Army east through the Saar region into Germany while the opportunity existed and the Germans were still reeling. Bradley, caught between these two forceful personalities and increasingly aware of the limitations of the Allied supply system, which was now operating at the extreme end of its reach, with trucks running day and night along the famous Red Ball Express Highway from the Normandy beaches, was struggling to articulate a middle path that preserved operational flexibility without gambling everything on a single line of advance. The fundamental problem was brutally simple. The Allies did not have enough fuel, trucks, or road capacity to support both Montgomery's northern thrust and Patton's eastern drive simultaneously at full strength. Someone would have to stop, and the question of who would stop and when would echo through the rest of the war. Eisenhower made his decision in early September 1944, and it satisfied almost no one. He adopted what became known as the broad front strategy, advancing along the entire line from the North Sea to the Swiss border, giving both Montgomery's 21st Army Group and Bradley's 12th Army Group priority based on operational opportunity rather than committing exclusively to either the northern or southern axis. Montgomery received temporary priority for his ambitious Operation Market Garden. The airborne assault on Arnhem launched on September 17, 1944, which ended in catastrophic failure when the British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed at the bridge too far. Patton's Third Army, meanwhile, was halted near the Moselle River in early September, his tanks sitting still not because of German resistance, but because his fuel allocation had been slashed to support Market Garden. Patton was furious, he believed, with considerable justification, that his army had the momentum and the open road to cross the German border before the Wehrmacht could reconstitute its shattered defenses. When the fuel finally arrived and his army resumed its advance, the Germans had used the pause to rebuild the West Wall fortifications along the Siegfried Line, and the easy breakthrough that might have been possible in September 1944 had vanished. The autumn fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, the Lorraine Campaign, and the bloody siege of Metz all followed. Campaigns that cost tens of thousands of American lives and lasted far longer than anyone had planned. And then, in December 1944, the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, precisely with those forces that had escaped through the Falaise Gap and been reconstituted in the autumn, proving in the most violent possible terms that the decision not to destroy the German army completely in August had consequences that could not be wished away. The story of Bradley refusing Patton's plan to split forces across two fronts in 1944 is ultimately not a story about who was right and who was wrong. It is a story about the impossible weight of command, the terrifying gap between strategic vision and operational reality, and the way that even the greatest military minds in history are bounded by supply lines, by geography, by politics, and by the irreducible uncertainty of war. Bradley made his decisions in real time, with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, and with the lives of hundreds of thousands of men in the balance. Patton's instincts were not wrong. They were simply untethered from the logistical ground truth that Bradley could not afford to ignore. History judged both men harshly and generously in equal measure. Patton as the blazing comet who might have ended the war sooner if unleashed without restraint. Bradley as the steady hand that prevented catastrophe while failing to seize the decisive moment. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, not in autumn 1944, as some had hoped, and the cost of those extra months, in lives, in suffering, in the further advance of Soviet forces deep into Eastern Europe, is incalculable. If you made it to the end of this story, you already understand that history is made not by the bold alone, nor by the cautious alone, but by the collision between them, and by the moments when one man looks at another across a map table and says, "Not yet, not like this, not at this cost." Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand that the greatest decisions in history were never easy. And leave a comment telling us what detail from this story you had never heard before, because every perspective adds another layer to a history that is never finished being understood.